Hello, my name's Tim Burbage. Welcome to Tim Burbage Reads, and today I'm going to be doing a top 10. These are my top 10 fantasy books ever that I've read, that I can think of right now. Fantasy books are a genre of literature that I really enjoy. I enjoy they take you to other places and explore themes through a different lens. There is a lot of fantasy fiction that I haven't read yet, because I went through a big gap of not really reading that much fantasy when in my 20s I didn't really read very much. A lot of this stuff is from the past 5 years when I've got back into reading, and some stuff from my childhood. There is some nostalgia in here, but I'm trying to be honest, and with all top 10 lists, mine is 100% correct, of course. Let's get started, I think. Number 10 is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So I only read this last year. Is it an epic quest of good versus evil? No. It's about an orc adventurer who gives up adventuring and wants to open a coffee shop. This basically started a very new trendy genre called cozy fantasy, where the stakes are naturally lower, but they're still important to the characters. One thing that makes this book particularly cozy is that Viv, the main character, does go through conflict, trials, tribulations, but she resolves them generally at the end of every chapter or every sequence. She finds a problem, she solves it. And that's really enjoyable to read. It's nice, warm feeling inside to see someone doing well, and it gives you a good feeling. So this book achieves exactly what it aims to do. So that's why it's on my top 10, at number 10. Next up is number 9. That is The Princess Bride by William Goldman. I read this a few years ago, not quite sure when, but I saw the film first. The film, I think, is perfection. I have a lot of emotional ties to the film. I watched it when I was a teenager with my mum, and I thought it was The Princess Diaries, the Anne Hathaway one. And my mum was like, let's watch this. And I was like, I don't really, Princess Bride, I don't really want to watch this. And then we put it on, and I was like, oh, look, there's Carrie Alwes from Robin Hood Men in Tights. I used to watch that. Oh, look, there's Andre the Giant from wrestling that I used to watch. Oh, look, there's Peter Falk, Columbo. We used to watch that. Oh, and there's the kid from the Wonder Years. I used to watch that. Oh, and there's Mandy Patinkin from Law and Order. We used to watch that. Oh, there's the guy, the voice of Rex from Toy Story. We watched that. Oh, there's Jenny from Forrest Gump as well. There's Billy Crystal from Monsters, Inc. and When Harry Met Sally. I think that's all the famous cast. Oh, and Peter Cook as well. Who could forget Peter Cook? Watching this film, this pastiche of a fantasy film, but was also still a fantasy film, is just perfect. I think the film is perfect. The book was written beforehand and got adapted into a film, and William Goldman wrote the book and the screenplay, so he adapted his own book into a film, which I think is quite rare. The book, I think, is outstanding. It is the best framing narrative I've ever read. The framing narrative elevates the story, and it's interesting because the framing narrative he had to change for the film. But it's basically the same story. There's very few differences. The framing narrative is a big one, but the wit, the charm, the love and tenderness really comes across in the book. Satire can be quite a mean genre, as it takes the mick out of those that went before. This is satire with love, I think. It's very earnest, and I really, really appreciate that. So that's why it's number 9 on my list. Number 8 is a book that I've just read recently, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This, I listened to the audio book only. I did a read-along with Ross and Laura at Hardy's Books. What a tremendous novel. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. It's a standalone. I think she has written books in the world, but it's a standalone. It's about two competing magicians set in Georgian England. It is written as if you were reading it in that time period. Spellings, the language that's used, the descriptions that are used, the way the dialogue is written, the way the characters speak, and the way the characters think about the world. That style is kept up and maintained throughout the whole book and is delivered with such panache that you just get swept up in it. I thought the story was interesting and you genuinely had no idea where it was going to go at quite a few points. But for me, the star is the characters. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norl are the most three-dimensional characters I think I've ever read, in that they are walking contradictions and they do one thing and they say something else, but it doesn't come across as inconsistent. It comes across as human. Side characters, Childermas especially, are outstanding. The side characters could be the stars of their own book. What they go through, their arcs, their changes, are incredibly interesting. I really, really enjoyed it. This could move up the list as it kind of ruminates in my brain. Their arcs, their changes, are incredibly interesting. I really, really enjoyed it. This could move up the list as it kind of ruminates in my brain. 8's where it's at the moment. Number 7 is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. This is the first series on the list. It consists of The Northern Lights, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. And then there is a follow-up series called The Book of Dust, which the first book is La Belle Sauvage. The second book is The Secret Commonwealth, and the third book is yet to be released. And I really hope Philip Pullman manages to get it out. That would be great. I read this as a kid when they came out, basically when they came out, kind of around the Harry Potter craze where these books got incredibly popular. I read them then. I remember getting The Amber Spyglass in hardback when it came out and devoured it. And then when I was in my 20s, 10, 15 years later, I was like, oh, I don't really remember these. I remember really enjoying them. I remember my feeling of enjoyment, but I don't really remember what they were about. So I reread them. One of only 2 book series I have ever reread. I read them as an adult and wow, did they hit. So what is His Dark Materials about? It is the antithesis to Narnia, I would say. So Narnia is a story of these normal kids put in a fantasy world with Christian allegories, and they go on adventures where ultimately everyone is okay in the end. His Dark Materials, I would say, is the opposite of that. We start off in another parallel world to our own, with the main character of Lyra Balakwa, probably one of the best young protagonists in fiction. She is fiery, she is driven, she is opinionated, but she isn't annoying. She makes mistakes, but you don't get frustrated with her choices. We then jump and have a different protagonist in book 2, which is a huge risk, I would say. And then book 3, The Amber Spyglass, it all comes together. I would really, really recommend this series. I made my wife read them, and she really didn't like The Amber Spyglass. She almost gave up, and I made her finish it, and she finished it and really didn't like it, and hasn't really read a book since. So, take that with a pinch of salt. I think Northern Lights is my favourite, the first book. The Subtle Knife takes some really big swings, and The Amber Spyglass tries to bring it all together. In terms of the later series, La Belle Sauvage, I really enjoyed. I really, really enjoyed that. And The Secret Commonwealth ended on such a cliffhanger, I got quite frustrated because I felt like it didn't write an ending, just didn't write a climax because it made it a cliffhanger, which was frustrating. There are also a few spin-off books, smaller short stories. Once Upon a Time in the North, which follows Lee Scorbies and Ulrich Bernison. Then there's also Lyra's Oxford, and I think there's something else as well, but I can't quite remember. I've read a mix of those and enjoyed them. I think the world is incredibly interesting. The characters of Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter are fascinating. This also has a good TV adaptation made by HBO and the BBC that came out only a few years ago. There was also a film that was tremendously cast and terribly made. So do with that what you will. Number 6 is a book that I only read last year by an author who I enjoy every single one of their books, and that is In the Shadow of the Wolf Queen by Kieran Millward Hargrave. She has written a few middle grade books. Then she started writing adult fiction, and now she's coming back to children's young adult fiction, fantasy, where in this world, like a primitive British Isles, there is magic in nature, in the trees, in the stone, in the earth, in fire. The magic of the world comes from nature and the physical geography of the world, which is incredibly interesting to read. We also have the Wolf Queen, the person who has invaded this land. And what the Wolf Queen does is whenever she invades a new country, she takes on aspects of that culture and melds it into her own culture, including changing her name to a local name. So as she invades this equivalent of the British Isles, she takes on the name Seren, an Old Welsh name. This is the human geography side that I found riveting in this world building of this empire that is made of bits and bobs of everything they take, so people in the empire feel a connection to the Wolf Queen, but she still keeps this homeostasis of her empire. The main character and her Seahawk go on a tremendous quest that is riveting to read, and I can't wait to read the sequel, which is called The Storm and the Seahawk, which is out, and I just haven't got it yet. And then I think the trilogy is finishing soon. Just an absolutely incredible read, and I really think you should read it. Number 5. Number 5 is the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. I'm a millennial. This was it for me, you know? Growing up, reading these books changed my life, I could say. They made me interested in reading, and they made me interested in engaging with literature and magic. Also, for me, I was at the age where the wait was part of the book. You know, you had to wait a year. Sometimes you had to wait 2 between these books. And I think it's incredible that she managed to write all 7 and get all 7 out, I think, within 10 years. Which is incredible when you think the later ones are really, really, really big. And it's very well plotted. It never jumps the shark at any point. And you can see the foundations were made in the first book, paid off in the 7th. This is the only other series I've reread. I reread this in my 20s, and it just hit me in nostalgia, not only for Hogwarts and for the characters, Harry, Hermione, Ron, Hagrid, all those, but also for my own childhood, and it took me back to reading it for the first time. And now, this year, I read the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, to my children. And they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And just to see it through their eyes as well, it's just brilliant. This is a complicated subject to talk about because of what J.K. Rowling has gone on to do after writing the books. In my mind, I can separate the art from the artist, but I can understand why people can't. I think people's emotions are really complex about this, and I don't mean to diminish the harm that the author has done to communities, but it's a line that I can still enjoy the books. I can still enjoy the world. We took the kids on the studio tour. I'm playing Hogwarts Legacy on my Switch. I'm in it. Have I bought any of the Cormoran Strike novels by the author? No. Have I bought A Casual Vacancy by the author? No. I can separate the Harry Potter book series and the J.K. Rowling who wrote that then, who I remember watching Blue Peter, and she got a gold Blue Peter badge, and she cried because she felt like the only way she would ever get one would be if if a child was in a coma and she was reading to them and the child woke up from the coma. That would be the only reason why she thought she could get a gold Blue Peter badge, and they gave her one and she cried. I also remember the J.K. Rowling who was the first person to come off the Times Rich list due to charitable donations and setting up a wing of a hospital. I can put that in a time capsule and deal with that. Doesn't mean I don't acknowledge that these things have happened and are still happening, but I can still enjoy this. If you can't, that's fine. I get it. Over 2-3 years ago, this would have dominated more. What the J.K. Rowling that we have today would dominate my enjoyment of the series. But then reading it with my kids, seeing them get completely enveloped in the world, has allowed me to enjoy this more. But if you can't do that, I get it. And it's something that's really personal to everyone and can change over time. For me, it has changed over time. So yeah, that's my number 5, a complicated one. Number 4 is a book series that I just adored called Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve. This is another young adult series. Did I read it as a young adult? No, I think I started it in 2020. The first series, which is the one that's on top for me, it consists of 4 books. Then there is a prequel trilogy, and now there is a brand new book that I've just done a review on. So if you want to find that on my channel, you can watch that review. The first quartet of Mortal Engines, Predator's Gold, Infernal Devices, and A Darkling Plane are just enrapturing for me. This is set in a far future post-apocalyptic world where, to survive, cities have motorized and become mobile. And we live in a city-eat-city world called municipal Darwinism. And we explore this world throughout the 4 books. We start on the city of London, which is mobile, and it has St. Paul's Cathedral on top. We meet Tom and Hester, the 2 main characters throughout the quartet, though there are definitely some changes there, who are interesting, engaging, very complicated characters. We see this bizarre steampunk motorized city world, and every single turn of the plot and every twist that a character makes, I loved reading. And at the end, the final chapter, probably the final half chapter, made me cry and was perfect for me. So this is a series, I haven't seen the film. I'd like to, but I just haven't got around to it yet. I've heard mixed things, but reading Thunder City recently really was like, wow, this is good. And Philip Reeve is an author, so this is for young adults. He's also written other books for children that I've read to my son and greatly enjoyed, really, really enjoyed. So he is one of my favourite authors. I've read a lot of his work, and Mortal Engines for me is it's just up there. It's so good. At number 3 is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. What can you say about this series? It is huge in scope. It is full of characters who are incredibly complex. It's about dragons. It's about magic that is unknowable, but it's about people and conversations and political machinations. It's riveting. You have no idea what is going to happen to any of the characters because plot armor does not exist. You have side characters who could be their own stars of their own books. Victorian Greyjoy out in the Iron Islands, I love that character. I could read a whole book about them. They're a very small player in this Game of Thrones, but they're so interesting. I think A Storm of Swords, the 3rd book, is the peak of the series, and right up there for the best fantasy book on its own of all time, I think. Maybe what brings this down a little bit is the fact it's not finished. The fact that George seems to have written himself into a bit of a corner. My view is that we might get Winds of Winter at some point. I don't think we'll ever get Dream of Spring. I think with Winds of Winter, it's possible that if something were to happen to George, that someone else might take it on and combine the notes together, because I'm sure George has done a lot of writing, just not managed to bring it all together. So it wouldn't surprise me if that happened to him. Same way as that the Silmarillion came out after J.R.R. Tolkien's death. It wouldn't surprise me if that happened with Winds of Winter, but I think Dream of Spring, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I'm okay with that because it's still fantastic. Fire and Blood is brilliant, and it's a history book about a place that doesn't even have any history because it's fictional. But the way that George writes and the way that George makes everything so real because he understands people. Because what makes A Song of Ice and Fire so brilliant isn't the dragons, it isn't the White Walkers, it isn't the magic, it isn't the swords, it isn't the great battles. It's the people, it's the characters. They're so real, with all their flaws. They're also different in their voice. Just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And number 2 is Legend of the Condor Heroes by Jin Yong. So this is one story split into 4 volumes because this was published weekly in a Hong Kong magazine or newspaper in the 1950s. This is set in 1200 AD China, where you have the Jin Empire have invaded the Song dynasty, and you've got these warring factions within China and a looming threat of Genghis Khan waiting to invade. So this is historical fiction. But what makes it fantasy is there is no magic, there's no wizards, no elves, no dragons. It's all about kung fu and qi, where using the powers of qi and kung fu and focus, these characters, some of whom are real historical characters, some of whom are fictional, can do tremendous feats of athleticism and spiritualism. This book, I'm going to call it one book because it is split over 4, is an absolute roller coaster. Covers a huge range of characters. We see characters come in and out of the plot. We follow the main character Guo Jing as he learns to control his qi, he learns kung fu and tries to become one of the great masters. It's so much more than that though. We see tales of honor and brotherhood. We see tales of love. We see tales of hatred. We see tales of racism between different factions of this China in conflict. Here, the characters are almost mythic in quality. It has a very fable-like storytelling to it. You have to suspend your disbelief because some crazy, crazy, crazy things happen. It's enjoyable in like a fairy tale, fable-ish way. And then I would say the end, the last book, A Heart Divided, really nails home character and the hero's journey and the development that the characters go through and the choices that they make and why they make those choices. Really, really interesting. This is a series that I'm planning to reread. I only finished the book earlier this year, but I'm doing a reread with Rebecca Nicole in January. I've got a video announcing that. We'll probably be doing a video once a week as we're doing the rollout of this read-along. Please join in. I would really, really appreciate it because it's my second favourite book, fantasy book of all time. My number 1 fantasy book of all time that I've read is Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Oh, Tim, you're so basic. Yeah, yes I am. It almost created a genre in its epicness, in its world building, in its characters, in its moral fortitude of the story that it tells. The prose is written in such a way that it's almost a religious, spiritual experience reading it. I read The Silmarillion this year and I felt moved by it. This is a book that I tried reading when the films first came out and I was like 13, 14. I bounced off Fellowship, kind of couldn't get through it. Came back to reading it when I was 15, 16, I want to say. I think it's the greatest story ever told. I've read, this year I've been kind of going into the history of fantasy, reading some stuff from the 70s and 80s, and it's all a knockoff of this. The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. It's just a knockoff of Lord of the Rings. And people say, oh, that's because that was what you needed to get published. Why is that? It's because any fantasy book that came out was still getting outsold by Lord of the Rings. So that's my list. Please let me know what your thoughts are, what your views on are. So, and I'll see you in the next one. Now get out of my house!